Today, we examine one of Mikhail Tal's greatest masterpieces, where the complications are fantastic even by Tal's own standards. During the game, Tal's coach Alexander Koblenz received condolences from Bronstein and Simagin, as Tal's position seemed absolutely hopeless. Tal's opponent Oscar Panno was of the same opinion, and only Tal evaluated it differently. In what might be one of the most chaotic positions in chess history, Tal's genius came to light, and the game proved him right. So let's dive in and try to find some order in this chaos. Tal starts with e4, Panno replies with e5, and Tal goes for the Spanish opening, bishop b5. After a6, white can go for the exchange variation, or, as Tal does, spend the tempo in order to retain the valuable bishop. Knight f6, black is attacking the e4 pawn, but white's common reply is short castle. Now, if black captures, that leads to the open defense, and white gets his pawn back after d4. White is ready to capture on e5, and black cannot capture the pawn, because that would lead to the opening of the e file. The king is on this file, the knight is also on this file, and after rook e1, of course, the knight would be pinned, and white is ready to capture on d4, followed by f3, attacking the pinned knight. But in our game, instead of the open defense with knight takes e4, Panno goes for the closed defense, bishop e7. And now that the bishop is closing the e-file, black is ready to capture on e4. The knight wouldn't be pinned anymore. That's why white defends the pawn. And now white is threatening to win the e5 pawn by first removing its defender and then capturing it. That's why black plays b5. Now his knight, which defends the pawn, survives. And after bishop b3, black plays d6. Now the d pawn defends this pawn. That means the knight doesn't need to keep an eye on this pawn anymore, and black is ready to play knight a5 and exchange the knight for white's most valuable piece in the Spanish opening, the light squared bishop. That's why white plays c3, vacating the c2 square for the bishop and preparing the d4 advance. Black castles, and if white plays d4 right away, bishop g4, pinning the knight, might be unpleasant. Black is threatening to win the d4 pawn by capturing on f3, and after queen takes f3, e takes d, black is winning a pawn. For this reason, usually, before playing d4, white first plays h3, taking the g4 square under control, and now white is ready to push the d pawn to d4. And now black has different systems to choose from. He can go for the Chigorian variation, for example, with knight a5, unblocking the c-pawn with a tempo by attacking the bishop, and after the bishop retreats, black starts the counterplay on the queen side with c5. Or he can also go for the Breyer variation with knight b8, rerouting the knight to d7, reinforcing the central pawn, and with the fianchetto of the bishop, black puts more pressure on the e4 pawn. In our game, black goes for another system. He reroutes the knight from the king side to the queen side, knight d7. The idea is to move the knight to b6, and both knights would be placed on the queen side, and black is going to start a very strong counterplay on the queen side. Besides that, the f6 square is vacated for the bishop, and after white plays d4, the bishop from f6 will put pressure on the long diagonal. Tal immediately occupies the center with d4, and knight b6 followed. Bishop e3, developing the bishop and intending to capture on e5, opening the bishop's diagonal, exchanging on b6, after which black will be forced to capture with the pawn, and his pawns on the b file will be doubled. Besides that, as the c pawn will move to b6, it cannot move to c6 anymore to control the d5 square, and that means the d5 square will be weakened and white will take this square under control. He will occupy this square. So, to prevent this, black captures on d4. After c takes d, Panno invades the a5 square, unblocking the c-pawn, attacking the bishop. The bishop is valuable, so Tal retains it, and c5. Black's counterplay on the queen side has begun. So what should white do now? if he makes the natural developing move knight c3, Tal writes in his annotations that he disliked the fact that after knight c4, which would attack the pawn and the bishop, he would be forced to return the bishop to its initial square. Probably the objectively best move for white would have been b3, taking this important square under control and depriving the black knights of this important square. But Tal plays, instead of this, in accordance with his style. He makes the sharpest move. He notices that the black knight, which used to be on f6, has been rerouted to the queen side, and that means the king side isn't sufficiently defended. So he plays e5, opening the bishop's diagonal and creating more tension in the center. And what should black do now? If he invades the c4 square as he intended to, attacking the pawn and the bishop, then Tal prepared queen d3, threatening checkmate. And after g6, white captures on d6, so black doesn't have time to capture the pawn or the bishop, as his own bishop is under attack. And after bishop takes d6, again, white doesn't let black capture neither the bishop nor the pawn. First he moves the bishop with a tempo, attacking the black queen, and after possible f6, bishop h6, this time attacking the rook. Black still doesn't have time for knight takes b2 because of queen b3 check, and both the knight on b2 and the rook would be under attack. So black must play rook e8, but in this case Tal was going to exchange the rooks, and after queen takes e8, b3, saving the pawn. The knight must return to a5, both black knights are passively placed now. c4 is under white's control, and white seizes the initiative with knight c3, followed by rook e1 with a tempo by attacking the queen. The white knight invades e4, attacking the weakness on f6. White is better. For this reason, instead of invading the c4 square, Panno makes the strongest move. He captures on e5. Tal recaptures with the knight. Now, of course, it doesn't make any sense for black to capture on d4, because that would activate the white's dark squared bishop, and both bishops would be directed towards black's king side. So instead, Panno this time invades the c4 square, attacking the bishop and the pawn, and also the knight on e5. Tal plays queen d3, threatening checkmate on h7. And if black plays g6, which was perfectly playable, Tal prepared again bishop h6, attacking the rook. And the best thing black can do in this case is to give up the exchange, letting white capture on f8. Because if he saves his rook, then Tal prepared queen f3 with the double attack. The only way to defend both weaknesses would be bishop e6, but in this case, white has different sacrificial ideas. For example, he can, maybe not right away, but as an idea, white can sacrifice on g6, destroying black's king side and opening the rook's file. And after h takes g, white can think either about bishop takes g6, and after f takes g, the bishop falls, so the rook would capture it, or even rook takes e6, and after possible f takes e, queen e4, there is no way to defend the g6 pawn, and the black king gets checkmated. For this reason, as Panno probably didn't feel like sacrificing the exchange after g6 and bishop h6, instead of g6 he plays f5, closing this diagonal. And now he again is ready to capture on b2 or on e3 or on e5, and after white recaptures, black would exchange the queens and get a better position. But Tal prevents all this by playing bishop b3. This diagonal is closed, so the bishop on c2 wasn't doing much, so Tal pins the c4 knight, but he lets black capture this bishop. Panno first plays f4 with a tempo, vacating the f5 square for the bishop, so the bishop will be very active on this diagonal. Tal moves his bishop to d2, and now it turns out that if black plays bishop f5 right away, that would be a blunder, because white would capture on a5, attacking the black queen in his turn, and after queen takes a5, white simply moves his queen away, the knight is pinned, it's attacked 3 times, and white actually has 2 threats. The first one is knight c6 with a fork, and the second one is knight a3, which would attack this knight for the 4th time, and white is winning. For this reason, instead of immediate bishop f5, Panno eliminates the valuable bishop. He exchanges his knight, which is on the edge of the board, for the bishop. Knight takes b3. And we have reached the position, the first critical position of this game. So black has just captured the bishop, and he is ready to capture the rook. So what should white do? Actually, both players had a spectacular idea in mind, but they evaluated the arising position differently. So you can pause the video, try to find this position, try to find Tal's move and idea, and also after that evaluate the arising position. So white of course cannot capture the knight with the pawn. That would be a blunder. After a takes b, black simply captures on e5. White cannot recapture as he is with the pawn. He cannot recapture with the pawn as he is losing his queen. So he would be forced to capture with the rook, and after bishop f6, attacking the rook must retreat, and black simply wins the pawn, centralizes his bishop, and gets a big advantage. But instead of a takes b, white could have captured the knight with the queen. That was perfectly playable. But in this case, the position would be equal after, white is currently threatening knight c6 with a fork, attacking the queen and the bishop. So black, in order to save the bishop, preventing knight c6 fork, most probably should play bishop f6, and the knight is pinned. White can attack this knight for the 3rd time, and after queen d5, knight takes c4, b takes c, queen takes, knight takes, and bishop takes d4. The position is equal. So Tal didn't feel like playing the equal endgame, and instead he comes up with a fantastic idea. Actually, both players had this idea. By playing knight takes b3, Panno offered the queen sacrifice, as he was sure that the arising position would be in his favor. But Tal accepts the sacrifice. He plays knight c6, leaving his rook under attack, but attacking the queen and the bishop. And the black queen cannot move because the knight would simply capture on e7 with a check. So Panno captures the rook, sacrificing the queen. Tal captures the queen. Before recapturing the knight, Panno with a tempo develops his bishop, attacking the queen and also eyeing the knight. Queen f3 followed. Now both the rook and the bishop and the rook are under attack, so black cannot capture the knight with the bishop as his rook would fall. That's why Panno captures the knight with the rook. And after rook takes e7, bishop takes b1, bishop is under attack, so Tal captures on f4, and rook takes d4. We have reached this fantastic position, the imbalanced position, one of the most irrational, chaotic positions in chess history, perhaps. The position Tal had been aiming for, and Panno also. But let's try to see why Tal, unlike all others, unlike Bronstein, Simagin, and his opponent Oscar Panno, evaluated this position in his favor. Because at first sight, black is better. Black has the material advantage. For the queen, he has a rook and two minor pieces, and the f4 bishop is pinned, it's under attack, but Tal still has his point. In his annotations, he helps us find some logic in this chaos. So he writes that the a1 knight is out of play in the corner of the board. The second knight can be kicked out with b3 later in the game. The white rook is very active on the 7th rank. Besides that, which is very important, we have the position with the opposite colored bishops. White has the dark squared bishop and black has the light squared bishop. And in these kinds of positions, the side who has the initiative has a big advantage. We can even say that the side with the initiative has an extra piece because the light squared bishop cannot take part in the defense of the dark squares. So all these ideas made Tal believe that white has the advantage in this position. So currently the f4 bishop is under attack, black is simply threatening to capture it, but Tal plays queen g4, threatening checkmate on g7. Black brings his bishop back into play, closing the queen's line, and still the bishop is pinned, this time on the 4th rank, and it's under attack. So Tal plays queen e6 check, unpinning his bishop, but bishop f7 followed, attacking both the queen and the bishop is under attack. That's why queen f5 defending the bishop, and Panno brings his knight back into play, knight c2. Of course, it doesn't make much sense for white to capture the knight, as his bishop would fall, the valuable dark squared bishop would fall, after which white wouldn't have chances to create an attack on the dark squares. So instead, Tal plays b3, attacking the knight. And Panno plays bishop g6. Probably he expected the repetition of moves. Probably he expected queen e6 check, bishop f7, queen f5, bishop g6, and the draw agreement. But instead, Tal comes up with another fantastic idea. You can pause the video and try to find it. What to do? The queen is under attack, the bishop is under attack. So what did Tal find in this position? Being down in material, Tal sacrifices more. So he captures on g7. After king takes g7, he sacrifices the bishop, bishop h6 check. Of course, the king cannot go back on account of the checkmate, so black must accept the sacrifice. King takes h6, queen takes f8 check. So now Tal has only one piece, the queen, while black has a rook and 3 minor pieces. But the black king is in trouble. King g5 followed, and Tal gets one of the pieces back. B takes c, but black still has the material advantage. Besides that, he has a dangerous passed pawn, which needs only 3 moves to promote. But Tal starts weaving a mating net around the black king. He plays g3. Now these squares are inaccessible for the black king. But Panno plays bishop e4, creating a terrible threat of checkmate in 2. Taking this diagonal under control, Panno is threatening rook d1 check, and after king h2, rook h1 checkmate. Tal plays h4 check first. Now if the king returns to the 6th rank, then Tal prepared f3, defending against the checkmate, and after the bishop moves, probably g4 would have followed, after which the black king wouldn't have any squares to move, and that looks really dangerous. For this reason, after h4 check, instead of king g6, the king moves to g4. And now, if white makes the inaccurate, obvious, natural-looking move Queen F4 check, he would lose, because the black king would invade h3. There are no more checks, and black is threatening checkmate. The only way to defend would be Queen c1, but in this case, black plays Bishop d3, followed by Rook e4 and Rook e1 check. For this reason, instead of after King g4, instead of Queen f4 check, in order to defend against the checkmate threat and in order to prevent the black king from invading h3, Tal plays King h2. And now he has a threat of checkmate in 2. Queen f4 check, the king cannot move to h3 anymore, so he would be forced to move to h5, and Queen g5 checkmate is threatened. How to defend against this threat? If black makes the obvious move Bishop d5, taking the f4 square under control and keeping this diagonal under the bishop's control, that would be a terrible mistake, because Tal prepared f3 check, forcing the bishop to capture the pawn. Now that the bishop occupies this square, the king cannot move there, and after that Queen c8 check would lead to checkmate. King h5, Queen f5 check, followed by checkmate. For this reason, in order to prevent this threat of checkmate in 2, instead of Bishop d5, Pano plays Bishop f5, closing the queen's line. So what now? At first sight, the obvious move is f3 check. But that would be a terrible mistake, because after king takes f3, queen takes f5 check, at first sight white is winning because the knight also falls, but the king moves to e3, and it turns out that the pawn is very dangerous. It moves forward. It isn't clear how white is going to stop it. The king, the rook support the advance of this pawn, and the knight is untouchable because of Rook d2 check, and white is losing the queen. For this reason, after Bishop f5, instead of obvious f3, which would be a blunder, Tal plays Queen f6. Again, creating a threat. Queen g5 check is threatened, and after King f3, first the bishop falls with a check, and then the knight falls. So, to prevent the invasion of the white queen to g5, Pano plays h6. Now, if white captures the pawn, then the black king invades f3, attacking the f2 pawn. The most logical move for white would be, as he doesn't have any checks, useful checks, so this check doesn't give anything, of course. So the most useful move, logical move for white would be Queen f6, pinning and attacking the bishop, but black has a beautiful move, Knight e3. Defending the bishop, black is still threatening to capture the pawn, and after f takes e, Rook d2 check leads to perpetual check, and the game ends in a draw. For this reason, instead of capturing on h6, Tal keeps creating threats. He plays Queen e5, threatening checkmate in 1. So Pano prevents it by playing Rook e4, attacking the queen, Queen g7 check, King f3, Queen c3 check, also attacking the knight. So, of course, black could have captured on f2, after which white would capture the knight, but as the knight is doomed anyways, instead of capturing on f2, Pano plays Knight e3. So, the pawn is still under attack, black is ready to capture it, but instead of capturing the knight right away, Tal plays King g2. So, his king wasn't doing anything on h2 anymore. The reason the king moved to h2 was to prevent the black king from invading h3, but now the black king is on f3, so the king moves to g1. Bishop g4 followed, and only now Tal captures on f3, and now we can see the idea behind King g1. Actually, Tal sets a devilish trap. At first sight, black can capture either on g3 or on e3, but it turns out that the pawns are untouchable. If the king captures on g3, then Tal prepared queen e1 check. Now if the king moves to f3, he gets checkmated in 1, and if he moves to h3, then king f2, threatening checkmate in 1, and after king takes h4, queen h1 check, and the rook falls. And what if after f takes e, instead of capturing on g3, black captures on e3? This time it's a more complicated trap. It isn't easy to spot. Tal prepared queen f6 check. Now, of course, the king cannot capture on g3. That's simple. After queen f2 check, king h3, queen h2 checkmate. If the king moves to e4, then queen f4 check, and black is losing the bishop. And finally, if the king moves to e2, that's the most beautiful variation. Queen f1 check, king d2, and a strong move, queen f4, attacking the bishop and pinning the rook. But black can try his last chance with c3, hoping that white captures on g4. That would be a terrible blunder, because after c2 it's black who is winning. White cannot stop the pawn from promoting. But instead of capturing the bishop, Tal prepared a beautiful move, king f2, attacking the pinned rook one more time, followed by queen takes e3 check. For this reason, instead of capturing on g3 or e3, as his bishop constantly falls under attack, Panno defends it by playing h5. Queen e1 followed. Now Panno captures on e3 and queen f1 check. Black still cannot capture on g3. That would be a terrible blunder on account of checkmate in 2. That's why the only move is king e4. The king comes closer to the pawn, so the king will support the advance of the pawn. Not this pawn, because this pawn falls right away after queen takes c4 check, but the second pawn on the c file survives. King f3, the queen returns to f1 with a check, and after king e4, Tal captures the second pawn, the a pawn, turning his a pawn into a passed pawn, into a dangerous pawn. But black has his passed pawn on the c file. So the g3 pawn is unguarded, but if black captures it with a check, which looks like the obvious move, after king f2, attacking the rook, and possible rook f3 check, king g2, white is threatening to play queen c4 check, winning black's passed pawn on c5. That's why it seems that king d4 is a logical move, preventing it, but queen b6 is possible, pinning the black pawn, preventing its advance, while the white pawn is ready to move forward, and white is much better. For this reason, after queen takes a6, instead of capturing on g3, Panno brings his king closer to his c pawn to support its advance. But Tal makes another strong move, queen d6 check, also eyeing the pawn. The idea is to force the black king to move to c4, right in front of his pawn. Now the pawn cannot move, while Tal's pawn starts its march, a4. Rook e1 check followed, king f2, rook e2 check, king f1, and rook a2, trying to stop the pawn. Queen a6 check, also defending his a4 pawn, king d4 followed, a5, c4. Let's see whose pawn will reach the first rank first. The first for black and the 8th for white rank first. Queen b6 check followed, opening the pawn's way. Now the logical move for black would be king d3. Black would love to play king d3 so that the king supports the advance of the pawn, but it doesn't work because of queen b1 check, also attacking the rook. The only way to save the rook would be rook c2, but in this case the rook is pinned, it's standing in front of its pawn, and the rook cannot stop the advance of the white pawn anymore. For this reason, after queen b6 check, instead of king d3, the king must move to d5. But now the king will not be able to support the advance of his pawn, while the white pawn keeps moving forward, a6. Rook a1 check followed, king f2, c3, a7, c2, but the pawn isn't supported by the king. Black is ready to promote to the queen, but queen b3 check, also targeting the pawn, king d6, and now capturing on c2 would be a terrible mistake. After obvious queen takes c2, rook takes a7, the black rook survives, and there is no way white can win this position, and the game would end in a draw. But instead of capturing the pawn right away, Tal makes, of course, he makes a precise move, queen d3 check. So where should the black king move now? If he moves to the c file, doesn't matter what square, or to e5, white would play queen c3 check, followed by queen takes a1, and the queen controls the promotion square of the pawn. If instead of these four squares, the king moves to, let's say, to e7, then only now white can capture the pawn, and after rook takes a7, white is winning the rook either by queen c5 check or by queen h7 check. And finally, if the king moves to e6, then again white captures the pawn, and after rook takes a7, queen e4 check. If the king moves to the 7th rank, then queen h7 check, winning the rook. And if the king moves to f6 or d6, then queen d4 check, again winning the rook. That's why after queen d3 check, Panno resigned. And now I recommend watching another masterpiece that helps to understand how Tal prepares the ground for his spectacular sacrifices. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.